Half a day. Half a day. Inano si Mike Lujan Bevacqua. My name is Michael Lujan Bevacqua. I am the curator at the Guam Museum. I am a teacher of the Chamorro language. I'm a historian, a writer, an artist, a community activist. Megay Tetsohu. I do many things. But I appreciate this opportunity to present to the Marianas Audubon Society on the topic of Paluman Chamorro, or Chamorro birds, their culture, language, and history. And so I originally gave this presentation earlier this year um, in person to the Marianas Audubon Society at the University of Guam, but it wasn't recorded. There was technical issues, and so I promised that I would record it and then send it to the Marianas Audubon Society so that it could be shared with other members as part of their effort to educate, to promote, to enlighten. And so I am now finally getting around to recording that presentation. And so in this sort of over the next 20 minutes or so, we will get into the birds of the Marianas, some of the ways that we can see their value to the Chamorro people through the way the birds have become part of history, symbolically, poetically, in other ways as well, but also connected to language and culture, identity. And so very excited, very excited. I do want to, I do want to sort of acknowledge in a proud fatherly moment that the drawings here that you can see are done by my oldest child, Sumahi, who is already a much more talented artist than I ever was. And so I'm very proud, very proud. But so before we get into the birds themselves, let's talk about something called the Guam Bus. And so the Guam Bus is a company that my brother Jack here, as you can see, that he runs, and then me and then my kids and our family help out with it. But the Guam Bus was started years ago, really in response to me having children, me getting older, me realizing sort of that a lot of the things that I would have liked or appreciated when I was a child in terms of representing Chamorro culture, the place, the Marianas, the islands we come from, the languages that are indigenous to these islands, like a lot of media that I would have loved at that time or appreciated on some level, it didn't exist. And that I grew up surrounded by, TV from the United States, video games from the United States and Japan, books from the United States. And so when thinking back on video games, movies, books, comics, these were all things important to me, but there was nothing in any of the media that I consumed or loved at that time that represented anything having to do with being Chamorro, growing up in Guam, the Marianas Islands, language, history, culture, flora, fauna, forget it, tadzaza, nothing. And so when I had my two older children, Sumai and Akli'i, who are here, I asked my brother Jack, I said, hey, why don't we just do something where we can publish things in Chamorro about Chamorro stuff? And we started in 2015. And as of today, we have created 3 bilingual Chamorro English children's books, 3 flashcard sets that have Chamorro and English on them, 3 comic books, and then our most recent item is a Guam Bus bingo set. And so if you are interested in purchasing our products, you can get them at places like Faith Bookstore, the local store, New Memories in Hagatnya Shopping Center. You can also get them on our website. But yeah, they are, in my opinion, and I am biased, they are great in terms of teaching not just a little bit of Chamorro language, but also stuff about history and culture as well. I was a professor for many years. I'm the curator at the museum. So in everything that I do, I try to weave some element of language and culture and history into it. And the Guam Bus is a perfect vehicle, pun intended, for that. And so one of the I mentioned that we had made 3 flashcard sets through the Guam Bus, that have the first one was for animals of Guam, the second one was for fruits and vegetables, and then the last one was for Paluman Marianas. And this was a set that focused on the birds of the Marianas, primarily native birds, but also a few introduced species of birds that are common nowadays. And so more than 24 birds, one side of it has a drawing. The initial sketches were done by my oldest child, Sumahi, and then my brother Jack finished them. And then we have the name in Chamorro, and then a scientific or English name as well, and then a sentence in Chamorro with the translation. And then on the back side, you'll find information on the birds and the types of nests that they make, how they raise their chicks, where they hang out on Guam, do they migrate, any legends or culture associated with them, anything like that, their symbolic meaning. And then also for some of them, are they still around? Komengagagya, are they still here? Or Kwestaman are they gone? Are they extinct already? Are they endangered? Are they only sort of found in captivity nowadays? And so the birds of the Marianas are important to the Guam Bus, but very important to me in particular. And so, basing on Amzudididi, I'll tell you a little bit about my sort of journey as a Chamorro. Is that I did not grow up speaking Chamorro. I did not grow up, as you can tell from what I mentioned earlier, knowing much about Chamorro stuff, because there wasn't, in the media that I was consuming in my everyday life, there was almost nothing about Guam or the Chamorro people or the Pacific in anything. And so it was not until I was attending the University of Guam that these issues started to become important to me. The fact that the question of why couldn't I speak Chamorro? My grandparents that I lived with spoke Chamorro. Why didn't they speak Chamorro to me? How come none of my cousins could really speak Chamorro? Why is it that I didn't know more? Like, I was living on Guam. Why is it that I didn't know more about Chamorro anything, even though I had lived most of my life on this island? And so the person who was most influential in helping me learn Chamorro and helping ground my identity was my grandmother and my grandfather, but most importantly, my grandmother. And so the work of the Guam Bus is dedicated to me and Jack, our grandparents. Joaquin Flores Lujan, Familian Bitut. He was a master of Chamorro culture for blacksmithing. Many would know him as Tunjak Lujan. He had a blacksmith shop at the Chamorro village where he would sell handmade tools such as the matseti, the fusinos, the tiaraspugua, the kamsu, the sotsu, the fiska. And so he was somebody that he was the last traditional Chamorro blacksmith, as in he was the last in there was many before the war, but he learned from his father, who had learned from his uncle going back into the early 1800s. And then my grandfather then learned also welding from the Navy and was worked in the machine shop for the Navy before World War II. And so my our grandfather is sort of a fairly well known in the cultural world and the Chamorro world on Guam, the Marianas, and beyond, because of his work in keeping alive Chamorro blacksmithing. But the person who is the most important in terms of me embracing my own identity, my own heritage, feeling proud to be Chamorro, or like the fact the fact that I can speak Chamorro, is really my grandmother, Elizabeth de Leon Flores, who married Lujan, Familian Cabeza. She was an educator, housewife, a gardener. She was the last valedictorian before World War II broke out in Guam for GW. And she was the person who helped me the most when I, as a senior attending the University of Guam, after taking 2 Chamorro classes, just felt like I needed to learn Chamorro. And so I went to my grandmother and I said, in broken Chamorro, I said, "Grandma, can you start speaking Chamorro to me all the time?" and she was very excited to do it. She had such a passion for the Chamorro language. And I remember that when she passed away, I wrote a series of Facebook posts said, Ti Catholico zo, ti man Catholico hamna gi familia. We are not Catholic in my Chamorro family. And so we don't have rosaries the way that many families do. So what I did when my grandmother passed away in 2013 is that I did 9 nights of sort of lisodzus, social media lisodzus, in which I presented something important from her life, or something that was meaningful and profound for me in terms of what she represented. And so one of the things that stuck with me, though, was my grandmother sort of talking about birds, the birds of Guam, when she was young and what they meant to her. So my grandmother once said to me that she worried that the Chamorro language would soon go the way of the Chamorro birds, quieted and eventually silent. Like most Chamorros my age in Guam, the only birds we ever seem to hear are planes and helicopters flying overhead. Through talking to my grandmother, I first learned about them and developed a love in absentia for them. And so, again, this is one of the realities. This is that we contend with nowadays, is that in just a few generations, this island went from being filled with the sounds of birds, the songs of birds, right? Like its own sort of natural chaotic symphony, to then the jungles now being incredibly quiet. That when you go, it's peaceful, but it is, if you have a long enough memory, it is sort of a very haunting peacefulness and quiet. And so one of the stories that I most remember of my grandmother was telling me about the Gatkarisu. My grandmother told me that there were no therapists before the war, and sometimes the only person you could talk to would be a bird visiting outside your window, or visiting beside you by the river rocks, or serenading you from above at the ranch. From what I gathered, the Gatkarisu, and it's also sometimes called the Gatkarisu, or the nightingale reed warbler, had the most special place in my grandmother's heart. They would arrive around dusk like long-lost friends with a tale that you would not believe hidden in their songs. Grandma never told me what she told the birds in return, but I imagine love, dreams, and loneliness were part of the conversations. And so the fact that there was always the sound, one of the things that I always love to think about is that Chamorro life used to be filled with organic songs. And that was very much mirrored, very much sort of replicated in the natural sort of symphony of birdsong that used to be on this island. And so it is in songs that we find one of the most important places that the Chamorro bird, that birds symbolically held for the Chamorro people. Now, one thing that I should, so this is one of the most important songs, sort of traditional Chamorro songs coming out of the 20th century, called An Gumupusi Paluma, when the bird flies. And so this song is what's called today we call it Samorita or Cantan Samorita. And it refers to a song which does not necessarily have set lyrics. It may have a set tune that's common, that everyone knows, that everyone remembers, but the lyrics are made up, sometimes spontaneously, sometimes borrowed from others. So, and sometimes these songs are thrown back and forth to each other, right? That people trade in these songs. And so one of the most famous songs in this tradition of Chamorro spontaneous improvisational communal singing is An Gumupusi Paluma. And so this is from an academic article talking about Chamorro songs from 1949. And the tune and the words came from Remedios Perez, Julita Manabus, and Maria Ulloa Camacho. And so, of course, the song, the basic tune, and people hear it differently. You have to remember that these are organic from the community sort of melodies, which means that some people may sing this to a slightly different tune or a very different tune. Zagumupu si Paluman, Zatumogi Trunkundoni, Atauguzu Sinana, Nai Bonita Baihukoni. And so, very, very simple. The most famous sort of version of this was recorded by Chamorro musical pioneer Johnny Sablan. And so, bearing in mind that the Cantan Samorita is an organic musical form, so you don't necessarily write down lyrics, right? It's all about taking a song that somebody has started and continuing it, adding your own lyrics to it, and then using it in whatever situation is appropriate for you, right? So one of the reasons why the Cantan Samorita is very important and powerful is because it is something that Chamorros use in response to Spanish colonization and the imposition of Catholic moral values on Chamorros. Is that Chamorros, as far as we can tell from Spanish accounts, had a much sort of liberal view of sexuality, of relationships, right, of sex, and so on. And so when the Spanish Chamorro Wars end and the priests come to dominate Chamorro life, basically Chamorros are no longer allowed to engage in those immoral practices or speak of those immoral things in the same way anymore. And so one thing that happens, like in many cultures that face this type of oppression, is that it goes underground and it morphs and it evolves. And so Cantan Samorita is part of that, is that the sexuality, the sort of the value of it to the Chamorro people doesn't disappear, but it has to become sort of hidden in metaphor. And through the communal Cantan Samorita songs, it becomes a way that you can throw things back and forth to each other and talk about things that are now taboo around the priests or around other Chamorros who have embraced these sort of particular morals. But you can talk about it now, but you have to use a metaphor. And these are metaphors that everybody in the community understands. The priests, who largely came from elsewhere, may not understand it. But for those Chamorros, those who are locals, they would understand. And so let's listen to Johnny Sablan's version real fast.
And gumupo si Paluman, Zatumogi Tronkundoni, Asangani zu Paluman, Nabonita Pavaikoni.
So one thing to note here, because Johnny Sablan's version is recorded, you could buy it. It first appeared on vinyl records. Now you can buy it on CD. You can listen to it on YouTube. Because of that, many people assume sort of that this is the way the song has always been. But one thing that always fascinated me is that for younger people, of course, the tree that the bird lands on is the doni tree. But I can remember lots of older Chamorros who grew up with Cantan Samorita as being a regular part of their lives would laugh because for them, their favorite version of it, it was a different tree. And part of it too is, as I was saying, the sexual metaphors, the symbolism involved. And so the troncondoni with the chili pepper, right? It becomes it's almost suggestive in that way. And so, but yes, not everybody sang it as troncondoni. I've heard lots of different versions in which people change the tree. And when you change the tree that the bird lands on, it may have some significance to what you intend to say with the song.
And gumupo si Paluman, Zatumogi tanantongan, Uhahasu itano guahan. Mati si Paluman, di sini ni ai Paluma Vanuatu Zabai tok tuk sini ni and kumanta si Paluma lalam langi adau zaman Flores alam tonu zaman magufi tau tau Gumupo si Paluma Zatomogi tronkun soda Antaguzu biospia Itsumoru siana Paluma Ai Paluma No izu papa Zatahi hita gumupo
Gov bonito tutu estina canta. Bonito tu I tunada zani. I mensai loque. Beautiful song. And Johnny Sablan's version starts off with similar sort of romantic, because Angumupusi Paluma is oftentimes a romantic song, because the bird can refer to sort of your dreams, your hopes, your wishes taking flight. The bird can refer to a person. So when you're singing about the bird, you are singing about the person that you are interested in romantically. But then towards the end, Johnny Sablan's version switches to become much more nationalistic in terms of asserting Chamorro identity or like talking about the Chamorro place in the world. Because towards the end, part of it is that the bird, when he sees the bird, he thinks of his island home of Guam. And at the end, he's told that he is going to go and find the Chamorro birds and that one of them is going to give him a wing so that he can fly together with all the rest of the birds. And so it's definitely sort of, it has a stronger political message than many versions of Angumupusi Paluma have. And so because one of the things that, that as you can imagine, Angumupusi Paluma was a song which, for example, was a courting song that people, young men and women who were interested in each other, they were not allowed to date under sort of traditional Chamorro Catholic culture. But in social settings around other people, you could sing to each other. And as long as you used metaphors, it was considered to be acceptable, even if you were implying very sexual things. And so that's why, for example, this part is not talked about as much, but the bird, of course, can represent the male sexual organ, right? That the flying of the bird can refer to a man becoming erect as well. So these are, of course, not the versions of the song that your grandmother or your grandfather would likely tell you about, but these were parts of what the meaning of the song was that if you, for example, were either amongst others, or if you were alone, two people, and you were courting each other, you could use this language and the symbolism of the bird, the trees, all of these things could come into play in order to help make your point that you love and care for this person, or that you are having very sexual thoughts and that you are putting them into these metaphors using the natural world in order to communicate what you're feeling. And so, let's talk about, we're going to change gears real sharply from that before I embarrass myself by talking too much about sexual metaphor, sexual innuendos and birds in Chamorro culture, because there's quite a bit more I could say. But let's get into some sayings, some ways in which the birds of the Marianas are woven into Chamorro identity, Chamorro values, and culture. And so one of the ways that I love to talk about Chamorro culture and identity and values is through wisdom sayings. Apahon is a word that is sometimes used for that, proverbs. So things that elders say, and they use sort of the particular experiences, the particular context that the Chamorros live in or have lived in, and then they use the world around them to sort of pass on lessons, right? And so one of my favorite is Sasangat Nasaina. Sasangat Nasaina. And there is a dispenses of Sasangat Nasaina, not Sasangan Nasaina. In fact, let me change that right now. Sasangat. Wait, no. Enegi problema. Dispenses of. Okay, so the Sasangat is the megapode. And so I, for a while, thought that it was already extinct, but I have been thankfully corrected that there are still Sasangat out there in the Marianas. And so Sasangat Nasaina means a unique parent or a parent who is like a Sasangat. And so one of the things that always I found really interesting is that the Sasangat would, after laying eggs, would then sort of pile things on top of it to incubate it, and then leave the egg and not be there to meet or care for its own kids. And so that makes it different than a lot of other birds in the Marianas. And so Sasangat Nasaina is something that you use to refer to a parent that is different and out of step with other parents. Now, this, like many sayings, could be used negatively to criticize somebody, that sort of like something's off with them or something's wrong with them. But you could also use it as a parent who thinks more creatively, Gifinu Ingles, out of the box, like a parent who does things very differently. And so I've always loved that. I've always loved this saying. And what it speaks in terms of just the ways that Chamorros came up with lessons or with perspectives using the world around them. Hungan. And so another good example of this is the Tzitzirika, or in the CNMI, it can be known as the Naabak. And so they say, this saying is also used for Tzatmutu Matitidzi Isihik. It can also be used for the Sihik. But the Tzitzirika, of course, is a bird which behavior-wise is a little bit different. A lot of the more noteworthy birds, the famous birds in the Marianas are Zomalau. They're very shy, right? The tot, the koko. The Tzitzirika is a little bit bolder. And so, for example, when kids follow or chase after the Tzitzirika isn't necessarily afraid and disappears immediately. The Tzitzirika might dance. The Tzitzirika might step back and then jump forward again. And so this makes it a bird which is very enticing to young people to follow, because it's one thing if birds just disappear to follow them, but this bird seems to have some intelligence. It has a plan. It's got an agenda. Maybe there's a party, right? Maybe there's something going on. How exciting. And so the Tzitzirika is very tied sort of superstition or belief-wise to the duendes, spirits of the jungle which kidnap young children that wander away from their families, farms, or houses. And so it's interesting then, because even if you don't believe that the duendes really exist, the duendes fulfill a similar role to what like stories like Hansel and Gretel and witches and Grimm's fairy tales provide for communities in Europe. These types of stories in which you fill spaces that are potentially dangerous to young people with fantastical stories meant to scare them, meant to warn them. The duendes and the tzitzirica are similar to that. And what I love is the fact that the tzitzirica, because of its personality, which is a little bit different than other birds, because of that, it actually makes a lot of sense that kids would follow it, and it makes sense to warn kids about it. It gives consistency to a legend, right? People may not believe this or care about this, but it seems to make sense, at least within the logic of the legend, to use the tzitzirica in this way. And so, but yes, and so I love that this is, this is a way of teaching kids to be safe, to stay close to the house, to kind of that in the human part of your village, of your ranch, this is your family, this is where we are. If you follow the tzitzirica marks the boundaries in which tisofuhau, you are not safe if you go into sort of the wild areas, the areas beyond. And let me tell you one more legend, because there are lots of stories related to Chamorro birds, and some of them are not super well known. Some of them are lesser known. And I always like to remind people that there are those legends which sort of become dominant. They become like the Chamorro CU, the Chamorro cinematic universe. Everybody knows about this Avengers, this Iron Man. But then you have lesser known legends, which maybe only one family told, or a village told, or only some people really told this story, right? Because legends have they have that nature to them, right? Is that they're stories which sometimes become large and everybody knows them, but sometimes they don't. But they nonetheless emerge from the community and its experiences. And so the most famous legends, of course, like involving birds, are like of the Kopko and the Hilitai. There's also one which was famous before. It's not as famous nowadays, of the Kak-Kak, why the Kak-Kak, the bittern is so thin. But my favorite legend to talk to kids about is the legend of the Sihik. The legend of the Sihik. And so the Sihik is one of the things that has happened in recent years, right? Is that our direct knowledge, the community's direct knowledge of birds, becomes limited. Because, for example, I have seen Sihik before. I have seen, the last time I saw a Sihik was in a zoo in the United States, and it was behind a cage. So I have never seen a Sihik in the wild. I don't know much about what the Sihik is like in the wild. And so our knowledge of these birds becomes incredibly abstracted, incredibly nyatata, very shallow, because we haven't seen them in the world. We have seen them only in these incredibly sort of specific, sort of caged environments, or we have seen them not at all because it's the stamenaigui. They're gone already. So we only know them from stories, or we can only understand them from making assumptions based on knowledge we have about other birds, or just stereotypical generic knowledge about birds in general, right? So the Sihik is one of those. The Sihik is known for its beauty, its beautiful colors, whether it's blue and orange or blue and white, right? It's a beautiful bird. And so that's why even some people use the Sihik sort of as for their branding, because it's just this lovely native bird. But the Sihik traditionally doesn't necessarily have that as great of a reputation. It could be a nasty bird, right? It's not necessarily a friendly bird. I remember hearing stories that the Sihik love to like kill chickens, love to dive bomb and use their big beaks to kill chickens. And so the legend of the Sihik builds on that idea of the Sihik as this beautiful bird, but also one which has kind of not the greatest temperament. And so in this legend, all right, there is a Chamorro woman who loves to wear beautiful, colorful dresses. and she loves to bake gof mangina finat mamas, delicious desserts and cakes. And but she's also somebody who is very vain, very selfish. So she bakes these cakes for herself. She doesn't like to share them with anyone else. She has the beehive Spanish oven that people used to have back in the day, and she bakes these cakes and she enjoys them herself. And so one day while she is out at her oven at her Hotnun Sanhizung, an old Chamorro man comes by. Now remember, she's an older Chamorro woman, but this is an older Chamorro guy, even older than she is. He comes by, Zanestagov Zadzas, Zafa, he's tired, he's exhausted. Gof Maods and Yalengwe, he's so hungry and thirsty. And so he begs and he pleads and he says, I put for but so please give me something to eat. And at first she says no, she has nothing for him. Lo hanginge, he smells what he smells what she's making, and he's like, please, you're baking something, it smells lovely, just I need something to eat. And so she says, fine, I'm gonna make you. But to herself she says, I'm gonna show this guy, I'm gonna teach this guy a lesson. So she takes her dough and she makes 2 cakes. She takes 2 cakes. One of them is for her, big thing of batter. I always say dough, batter, batter. And the other one for the old guy is a small little morsel like this. A big cake for her and a little bit for him. She puts them both into the oven and then she waits. And then the old man says, oh, is it done? I'm so hungry. When she opens up the Hotun and Sanhizung, she is aghast to find that her cake, which used to be big, is now small. And the old man's cake, which started off small, is now big. Frustrated, she says, must be something wrong with this batter. And she tells the old man, it's not ready yet. Nanganaza. So then she takes more. She makes hers bigger. She makes his even smaller, puts it into the oven, bakes it. The old man says, oh, he's so hungry. When she opens the oven, though, it's happened again. Hers has gotten even smaller. The old man's has gotten even larger. And finally, she uses the last of her batter and she gives everything to herself. She takes a little dot on her finger and puts that for the old man and puts it in the oven. And when she opens it up, the same thing has happened. Hers is microscopic, the old man's is everything. But this time, when she looks at herself, remember, she was wearing this beautiful, colorful dress. When she looks at her fingers have turned into feathers. And when she looks at her dress has become colorful feathers on her body. And before she realizes it, she has become a Sihik, and she flies away into the jungle. And so the moral of the story is fairly obvious. One of the most important values that Chamorros had in the late in the Spanish period, but also even earlier, and to some extent up until today, is the need to be generous and to provide and to help others. And so this legend is really about sort of not being too selfish, not being too individualistic, but taking care of others, taking care of your community. And that if you don't, then you get stigmatized, you get cursed with it. And so the older woman becoming the Sihik is interesting because it's in the same way in which Chamorros used to curse greedy people in their community by giving them nicknames, which everyone would use for that person behind their back, acknowledging that they were not a tigaftao, they were not a generous person. And so a very different side to the Sihik than you might be used to. And so for me, one of the reasons why I love incorporating birds into the creative work of the Guam Bus, or like myself, or the things that I do, is because this knowledge of the birds, of Chamorro birds, those who lived lives in Guam in which there was birds everywhere, they are dying, they are disappearing. And we cannot take their experiences from them. We cannot know firsthand what that was like, but we can take their stories. We can remember them. And the values and the symbolism and the meaning, we can find ways to keep it alive, to teach new generations about it using things like books, like art, like songs. And so I want to share with you two final sort of things. So on the right here, this is something that my brother Jack drew that we made a few years ago. So there was the hard cocoa core, the hard cocoa core. So who knows how you're supposed to pronounce that? But you can see here, this is based on a Valiant. If you're familiar with comic books, this was a company that was around and it gained a lot of prominence, became very popular in the 90s when me and my brother Jack were collecting comic books heavily. And so there was a comic called The Hardcore, Hardcore, whatever. And so we recreated the cover of it with the cocoa birds. And the cocoa birds have weapons and they have particular powers, and their enemies are the brown tree snakes, which are one of the biggest threats to native birds in the Marianas. And so, you know, I've always found ways to incorporate birds and stories of birds in everything that I do, to keep the memories, to keep the knowledge, the wisdom first given to me by my grandmother and given to me by so many others, to keep it going, right? And I was so happy. The first slide here started with drawings from my oldest child, Sumahi, who is now attending the John F. Kennedy High School. And so this was a painting that Sumahi did last year, showing the prompt was, this was for the Fenhita Youth Conference last year. It was a decolonization youth conference in which they were encouraging young people to think about decolonization. What does it mean for you to educate on issues like Guam's political status, and what are the three future options, statehood, independence, free association, that Guam could become. And Sumahi attended art workshops there in which the students were asked, draw or paint decolonization and what it means to you. And so Sumahi came up with this, in which, and it's not complete, Sumahi didn't finish it, but it shows a cocoa bird which is killing a brown tree snake. And to Sumahi, that represented decolonization. Gofzao. But it's an important step, using art to remind, to preserve, to inspire, whether in terms of political status or whether in terms of our relationship to nature, and to sort of our relationship to these birds, which were so precious to our ancestors, and the connection of which has been largely broken and disrupted by those of us today. And so, Sidus Masi no Hamzu Todos, I hope that you found this interesting. I hope you learned a few things. And Dispensa Zutalu Asi Idzu, my apologies again that it took so long to record this and to get it to you. And no haparapago, ajos. Este ki mana lihitalo.